Welcome to Courtroom Homeostasis. We have another episode with one of our colleagues, Kathy Garcia, today. But before we get to our guest, my name is Wendy Patrick, and I'm a career prosecutor and threat assessor, and also an expert on all things that go on in the courtroom, having literally spent over 2 decades of my life as pretty much my courtroom as my office. Robert?
I'm Dr. Robert Perkins. I'm a retired police officer, professor of applied psychophysiology, and an expert in stress and trauma in any situation. But today we're going to be talking specifically about some of the things that cause extreme stress and trauma in a courtroom environment. And we have with us today Kathy Garcia. Kathy, thank you for joining us. And I was wondering if you could tell me what was your role in the courtroom, and did you find that particularly challenging?
Well, I had several roles over the years as first a police detective and police officer, and then as a district attorney investigator. I'm going to focus a little more on the time as a district attorney investigator, as I know you've interviewed some other people that are from police departments. And as a DAI, for short, for district attorney investigator, there's a couple things that we did a little different or that we had to think about more. And one of them was courtroom security, being an investigating officer sitting next to Wendy or another prosecutor, making sure that everything's covered, that the questions are covered, that something wasn't skipped over because a witness answered a certain way. So a prosecutor may go down another avenue or a defense attorney may go down another avenue and something could get missed. But one of the big things about covering is the witnesses. Sometimes there are threats to witnesses, particularly in stalking cases, gang type of cases, murder cases. There can be threats to our witnesses, and to keep them safe in the courtroom, maybe arrange with the bailiff to bring them in through the back of the courtroom, make sure their testimony goes off, and then that you get them out of there safely as well. So sometimes some things like that. And likewise for your prosecutor, if there's threats during the case or anything for the prosecutor happening that way, witnesses, perhaps your defendant is out on bail during this court process. So if there's any type of security issue or safety issue, that can be highly stressful because you don't want anything like that happening on your watch during court. So not only mentally thinking of everything being covered and making sure your case is being unfolded to the jury as it should be, it's safety and security has to be thought of as well. That's the thing that came to mind the most when you asked about the role.
Kathy, I'm glad you emphasized your time working as a DA's office investigator, because you're right, that is different in a lot of ways than working out in the field as a police detective. And you and I have worked many cases together over the years.
Yeah.
I was wondering, were there any certain types of cases that you found more difficult to handle and listen to the testimony in a courtroom than others, and why?
I'd have to say there's a couple that come to mind, and I don't know if it's necessarily those particular cases or if it's just an accumulation. I think a lot of law enforcement stress and courtroom stress isn't one case, two case, a certain case. I think it's a buildup. I think that after 30 years in law enforcement, it can be the most minor thing at the end, but you're up to here in your stress level of handling witnesses, of listening to tragedy over and over again. The couple that I thought of the most, there was you have to have such compassion for all parties involved. So even sometimes if it's like a defendant's parents watching a murder case, that can be really, really sad. A severely injured child I had on a case, and that case really stuck with me. The baby ended up being a little vegetable baby because of what her mother had done. And so that really stuck with me over the years. In fact, after that, I put in to go work in real estate fraud. I was just like, okay, that's enough of this for a little while, so I don't know that it's necessarily one awful case. There's a lot of awful things, and it's not one awful incident. one of the other things that was always really hard is when there were child witnesses, or even maybe more of a naive person as a witness, to convince them so hard, work with them so long and convince them to go to court and really be there with them, have your advocates there with them, hold their hand through the whole court process, and just knowing how brutal a court process can be and how getting questioned by the defense can be, or seeing their perpetrator can be. That can be very stressful to reconcile in your mind, that you're doing the right thing, it's your job, but to take somebody there when maybe for them it may or may not end up being the right thing. A conviction doesn't change their life. So that's probably one of the hardest things.
And how did you personally cope with exposure to traumatic evidence? Did you have any special methods of dealing with it? And then did it get easier or harder over time?
I'd say it didn't necessarily get easier over time. I think the way you cope, and the way a lot of people in stressful jobs and professions cope, is compartmentalizing. This is work time. This is what I have to do here. I think maybe it's harder over time only because in your younger years, you don't understand as much. You worry about it less. You're working tirelessly, that kind of thing. So maybe it gets a little harder over time just because you know what all's involved. So aside from compartmentalizing, everybody has their own things they do for coping. I have a lot of friends that I can talk to, inside work, outside of work. Always getting physical movement in, whether it's a hard workout or just being outside in the air, that kind of thing. So I think it's just whatever makes you feel better. Some people cook, some people swim, always hugging your kids and making sure you have to set a limit on thinking about the court case for the night.
Well, that's awesome. You seem to have like a real wellness strategy that you deployed in order to sort of keep balance in your life. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the stress and trauma that law enforcement officers end up suffering from is not just because of a single incident. It's accumulated trauma. And, every time a law enforcement officer is exposed to a traumatic event, there's a debt incurred. There's a debt incurred. There's wear and tear on the human body, and that debt has to be paid. And that's both principal and interest. And the amount of interest that's going to be paid, both in time and resources, is going to be dependent on how long that individual waited to process that trauma, or to sort of seek help from that trauma. And, I've seen officers go their entire career. They've been there, they've done that, they've been involved in some tremendously traumatic incidents, and yet it didn't really seem to faze them at all until they retired. And, these officers have been so busy their entire career. And now all of a sudden they're sitting out in a boat fishing, and for the first time in their life, they've got quiet, and they've got some sort of space on their brain, and that slideshow of all of the things that they'd experienced in their career starts to come to the forefront. And they don't know how to deal with that because they've never felt those sort of sensations before. So accumulated trauma is a very, very big issue with law enforcement. Now, having said that, what advice would you give to individuals in a similar position that you served in that have to spend a majority of their time in the courtroom and being exposed to stress and trauma, being recalled in evidence, or seeing the victims of crime or the perpetrators of crime?
A couple things. Okay, so for myself, I'm a very empathetic person. So I think one thing of advice is know yourself, know your traits, know what you're good at, what you're bad at, what can be your downfall. Because I'm an empathetic person, I'm super successful with witnesses, especially like sexual assault victims, getting people to come forward, getting people to come to court, getting people to talk to me. And that's all really well and good, but that being empathetic can really hurt you as well. You have to make sure you're super professional, not take on anything else that that isn't yours to take on. Be professional, doing your job, have a professional outward appearance. You just have to educate yourself on being able to help others, know what's available to you, knowing yourself. And like you were just talking about, some people do bottle it up forever and ever and ever. And I've met those people and those detectives and those courtroom prosecutors. And I think, oh boy, when this one goes, it's going to go, and balance in your life. You can tell a young officer, this isn't everything, you really need to have balance. Well, keep saying it, because sooner or later, they're going to go from 25 to 30, from 30 to 35, 35 to 40. If they have any longevity at all in the career, then you will be able to set some limits and balance it out better. And I know that for the prosecutors as well. The longer you do it, the easier it is in one respect, because you know what you're doing. So to write your list of questions or poll your jurors or do some of the things that we normally do in a courtroom, they're not as daunting because you've done them a few times. So I think it's knowing yourself, and then just always have a professional outward appearance, and set some limits for yourself, honestly.
That skill set of being able to do that, both from an awareness and a educational perspective of understanding stress and trauma, as well as having methods to deploy how to diffuse those stress and trauma. I like to refer to that as psychological body armor. When we go someplace that's very, very dangerous, we want to make sure that we have all of those pieces of equipment that are going to protect us and allow us to still perform optimally. And, young officers, there's going to be a very vulnerable period of time in the beginning of their career, as they sort of like a caterpillar. There's going to be a metamorphosis of their personality. Everyone changes. And, those events leading up to that point of the metamorphosis are crucial. And if they don't have that emotional or psychological body armor present, who they become after that takes place, cannot be always a positive thing or an optimal thing.
Kathy, after a particularly emotional day in court, what are some of the ways you would unwind at the end of the day?
Definitely. My sister lives on the East Coast, so definitely calling and talking with her, walking my dog, and not necessarily about anything important. It's not that you have to debrief the case or anything. It's just talking to a loved one on the phone, playing with the dog, walking my dog. I am a cleaner, organizer person. When stuff in my life is a little bit out of control, I clean something in my house. I do my laundry. I get something straightened up. I clear a cabinet, because I need control over something like that. So sometimes if I'm upset, that's how it will manifest itself for me, which is good and bad. There's a lot of good about that, but there's a lot of bad about it too. So I have one close work friend, similar job type of thing. She's always my go-to for anything. This particular thing happened in court. What do you think about that? What should I do? She would be my one person for that kind of thing. But mostly it is just get something back under control, get some fresh air, and, be able to de-stress that way.
Kathy, when you look back at your position in working in the courtroom, can you recall if any of your colleagues ever talked about the stress and trauma that they were incurring while working in the courtroom environment?
I think I wouldn't say it was exactly just the courtroom environment. I know as a DAI, we talked a lot about how court is difficult because you always have to be on. I think the prosecutors would say the same thing, and I've had prosecutors say the same thing to me, that when they're doing their week-long jury trial, that is all they do and all they think about, because they have to really, really be on. And a little bit is the same for us as an investigating officer, or particularly if there's any kind of security issue that, yes, we have talked about that kind of thing. I just think that anything about the stress and courtroom stress, when you hear child molest victims talking over and over, or I just think there's a reason in law enforcement why there is it's a horribly stressful job. And it just, like we're saying, it's more cumulative. And if you do work and have to hear about like sexual abuse over and over, or especially a vulnerable type of victim, it can be very, very difficult. So in talking about it, we talk to peers maybe about it, or the prosecutor I was in with, that's who I would talk to about it.
Kathy, was there ever a time while you were working actually in the courtroom environment that you ever feared for your own safety?
The only time I was on a defendant's hit list one time, a prosecutor and they had found a hit list in his jail cell, and we were listed on there. And he had ties to, I can't remember if it was Aryan or Hell's Angels or something, some kind of ties in San Diego County. So that was the only time that it was like, ooh. And there was believe it or not, a fraud lady at the end that she really, really, really hates me. In fact, it's why I don't do social media stuff to this day. Wow. Luckily, there's a newscaster in San Diego with my same name, and so I don't worry about getting Googled and having that come up much. But I can't do any of that until I move out of this county, because I know how much they hate me. And it's like a parolee type of son that's in for armed robbery. It's bad people, even though it was a white collar type of case. So those I'm very careful about. And of course, in court, I had the advantage of I was armed. There's a bailiff. I know the inner workings. I know the back door. I know how to get my witness out. So as far as an environment like that, of anybody, I had the most advantage. Every now and then you get a big gaggle of people, maybe gang members or something that are, or just scary people that are supporting the defendant in the case. That can be scary. But again, then if Wendy and I were in there, I'd get her out the back door, so that I could control my environment or recognize it. I think I had a leg up on a lot of people. I think it's maybe scarier for others that aren't sitting in there armed and knowing exactly who's who.
Did you find it stressful from going and being a police officer where really, you're outside most of the time? The radio really is your boss, and there's a lot of freedom to now all of a sudden being confined in a relatively small amount of space where you're not sort of in control of when you can come and when you can go, coming from an environment of a little bit more freedom. Was that particularly stressful at the beginning?
Yes, very stressful. In fact, that's probably one of the most stressful things about court. And it sounds silly to say, but that you are confined, you're on someone else's timetable, you're making sure whoever's up there is safe, you're making sure your prosecutor's safe, and making sure things unfold as yes, I think just the environment itself, and because it's a very formal environment, and there's somebody, potentially a criminal in there, whether they're convicted yet or not, or perhaps that there's a super long rap sheet of the person, that the person has a huge criminal, they're a career criminal. So you're confined and with a criminal element, yes.
And you also may know the rap sheet includes offenses against law enforcement sometimes, where other people aren't aware of the history. You brought up a great point in that the fear and the safety concerns outlive the case. In fact, they outlive the career. as you're now in threat assessment full time, or it's one of those things that we forget about, that just because you've quit a department or you've quit a job or you've moved on, you've retired, that doesn't make any difference to the bad guys sometimes. And I do remember the case that you're talking about the defendant with the hit list. Before you went into this job, this role, the courtroom heavy role as you had in the DA's office, what education or advice were you given about how to deal with trauma and stress in the courtroom?
I don't know that anything was said specifically about the courtroom itself. Now that I think back on it, there's a lot of education on dealing with stress and staying physically healthy and eating right and that kind of thing, and keeping non-law enforcement friends. There's a lot of that. The only courtroom training I really remember was what to expect, and that it's a super formal setting, and don't talk unless you're asked a question, and that kind of thing. So I wouldn't say there's anything specific about courtroom stress that was taught at all. It just was something you learned. How to deal with it is something you learn while you're going through all these court trials. So I actually hope for lawyers and prosecutors and people, maybe the judges, clerks, and people like that, that there are a lot more things taught and coping mechanisms taught for courtroom stressors.
Kathy, you identified some of the ways that you were able to sort of deal with the stress that you incurred. I call them stress busters. Did you observe other people that you worked with that maybe didn't handle that stress and trauma as good as perhaps you did? And how did that make you feel?
It's funny because sometimes you see people more stressed and sometimes you'd see people way less stressed. And again, it could just be that particular incident was their tipping point, or that particular incident that day or that court case was my tipping point, and I was upset or crying or whatever, and always cry alone is it's a rule. Professionalism, and never let them see you sweat or cry, especially as a female in law enforcement. Okay, that's just a rule. There, as I said before, there's way too many suicides. There's one guy I can remember, and this isn't knocking him in any manner when you're talking about dealing with stress. There was a man I worked patrol with, and he had got shot 3 times. And after that time, I never saw him. He tried to do like duty for a while after he physically healed. And I'd see him around the courthouse or see him around the police department, but he tremored. After that, he just never, ever settled down and never stopped tremoring. And I think he did eventually retire, which, he should have. But you just never know what the thing is going to be. There's people that handled, in my esteem and in my thought, they handled like nothing, didn't work a stressful area, barely did any detective work on homicides or crimes against people or sexual assault or barely did any of that. But the stress affected them more for some reason, or being in a courtroom affected them more. There's people that went to a homicide a day and saw a blown brain out a day and had to deal with a crying mother a day, and they are seemingly handling it outwardly fine. But I think we don't really know how somebody's handling it. Only the person knows, and only you know how you're doing inside. We can do a lot of things to cope. A lot of these things I was saying about, I like to get fresh air, take my dog for a walk. I like to talk to my sister, whatever it is, we can do a lot of these things to cope, but you don't know what's going on inside or what's going to bother you.
Yeah, one of the things we don't always keep in mind in that particular person you're referring to that have been shot, when you combine a physiological injury with a psychological, very stressful situation, the state of hypervigilance once an individual has been shot, they'll develop a way where they're so tense all the time, they're not getting enough oxygen to their body, and that can manifest itself into something called essential tremors. And it can be extremely frustrating. But it's really important that people understand that, you know, many of these things, these are natural reactions to a very abnormal set of circumstances. You put any human being, you physically traumatize him by being shot, and then you combine that with the psychological trauma of being in that situation, of perhaps you know, almost dying. You know, it's very, very difficult for officers and anyone to sort of bounce back. Yet many times that's our expectation.
Yes, and the thing you just said about it being this unusual circumstance, or I can't remember the word you used, but that's this abominable thing that we're supposed to go on these radio calls or to witness in court or take a little kid, you know, it's going to be okay. And her daddy's in there who molested her, you know, those kinds of situations and things that we are privy to and witness to. It's a lot. It's a lot to deal with.
When you were working in this particular environment, and I'm sure that there are more stressful days than others, but from your employer, what did your employer tell you, resources that were available to you to deal with stress and trauma that you were incurring in the court?
Both the city of San Diego and the county have like their own psychological services, their own whether it was called employee assistance, psych services, and also your own healthcare. So I'd say both in law enforcement for a police department and just in a regular workplace, they tout those resources, but I can't say there was anything day to day. You know, I think many large workplaces, and particularly a government type of workplace, is going to have some kind of psychological resources in this day and age. But it is definitely, you seek it out and you worry about if there's a stigma or if they know, or I would think that's universal.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Kathy. This was very valuable, particularly the unusual route that you've taken with respect to continuing to work after several retirements. I guess nowadays it shouldn't be that unusual, but it really was great to listen to. So thank you so much for your time.